Hi, folks. I hope you're all doing reasonably well. Today, I want to not zero in for most of the time on a single topic, but deal with a bunch of international issues that are swirling around that are not really getting adequate attention because, of course, we're all fixated on the fires and the virus and so forth. Before I deal with the first topic, let me go back to climate change just for 30 seconds. Remember when I talked both about long-term climate policies, but also about mitigation that various countries are doing about rising water levels, damage of hurricanes, and so forth. So that issue has recently, really in the last week, seriously arisen with respect to the fires on the West Coast, because these are not going to be the last fires, right? And most of the buildings that are in the fire range, or at least in the woods or near woods on hillsides, uh, they are going to be repetitive. And the question is, whose houses burn down? And by and large, either poor people or affluent people are the ones that are most affected. Poor people have moved into the range of forest because it was cheaper, and very often they have wooden structures and even mobile homes. Affluent people have moved into various vista areas, often partially in the woods or totally in the woods, sometimes looking at the ocean. So there's sort of two economic classes that are most hit by the damage. Now, the other thing I just want to say is that Trump is going to arrive in California. I think it is today when I'm recording this. And of course, he's still a climate denier. And while in previous fires, he said the Californians just need to rake their forests, this time around, it's forest management. That is to say, people aren't taking care of the dead woods in the forest, and that's why you have these raging fires. It's not because of climate change. He actually has a point, and that is to say that the combination of climate change and drought and hot winds in combination with forest undergrowth are combining to create the crisis. Now, the problem, of course, is that much of the forest land in the US that is burning up are, in fact, federal forests. So the question arises, this is not just a problem of states and localities, this is a problem of the federal government. And of course, funds have been cut for the forestry service and so forth. So it's sort of interesting to see these spin-outs. The spin-out that I just want to highlight for a moment is the mitigation, which I talked about when I talked about climate change. That is to say, people are beginning to say, okay, so we're going to have climate change, even a slowdown in putting, fossil fuels in the air and other global warming chemicals will take some time. We're dealing with the here and now of the next few years, and that's not impacted by new policies. Those new policies, climate change policies, would impact down the road in 10 years and 15 years. So what do you do in the meantime? And one of the mitigation measures that architects are seriously discussing is that buildings need to be built differently. You can build houses where the outside walls are fire resistant, where the roofs are fire resistant, where the windows are fire resistant. And there's a serious discussion that has really sort of ignited in the last week or 10 days since we last met, of in various fora and magazines and so forth, architects saying, look, it is foolish to rebuild in the way these buildings have burned down. And of course, we know a lot of the people that are burned out say they want to stay on the land they were on and rebuild. So the mitigation discussion is in some ways as interesting and a matter of policy and funding as the, preventing further climate change and global warming. So that's just a commentary on what we talked about before. So let me take up the Middle East as the first issue. As you know, not only the UAE countries, but now Bahrain has recognized Israel. And the question, of course, arises, why all this recognition and what difference does it make? Well, the recognition right now has relatively little to do with the Middle East and a lot to do with Netanyahu and Trump, who want to take a victory lap that they've created this sort of more peaceful Middle East. Countries recognize each other, and things will now be better. On the actual ground, the difference isn't very huge because Israel has been trading and supplying technology and arms to most of those countries anyway, sometimes even economic support here and there. So, it sort of sounds like there will be a whole new relationship out there. And the whole new relationship is the one negotiated by Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to make it look like Trump is, in fact, creating a big, new, peaceful Middle East, right? That's something that no previous president, certainly Democrats, have not achieved. So, and Netanyahu is in political difficulty at home, now exacerbated by the serious new outbreak of the virus there as well. And so he needed a victory as well, right? So the compromise for Netanyahu was to hold off for now capturing the West Bank. He promised he wouldn't move ahead just now. That doesn't mean he's not going to move ahead later. And for the various Middle East countries which are now recognizing Israel, it's a favor to the United States, by and large, to do it just now. And some other countries may come along, Oman probably, maybe even Chad in Africa, Sudan. Saudi Arabia is a question mark because they're not so keen, but in due course, they'll probably come along as well. So what's the payoff for these countries right now? The payoff is American technology and arms. They have been promised all kinds of new toys, military toys, including F-35 fighter jets. By the way, I'm not an expert on military hardware, so I have to take other people's word for it. This is a spiffy, state-of-the-art airplane, which doesn't just have missile capacity and all those good things, but is a kind of major communication hub, which can do intelligence work of all different kinds and spy work and so forth. So you can imagine some of the leaders of these small countries actually want these toys, and they've been promised that they would be getting these toys as long as they recognize the state of Israel right now. So for them, it's a small price to pay in some ways, and it has a huge military payoff. Now, there's an irony, which some of you might have noticed in all of this, because Trump made this big to-do about, anti-military. It came out in the books about the Trump administration that he called, people who served in the military, all kinds of derogatory names. They were fools to serve in the military, idiots to gotten themselves killed in various wars, and so on. So that's how it started. Trump's anti-military rhetoric started. Then the next level came when he started attacking the Pentagon, of all places, and attacking the Pentagon in the last week or so by saying the people that make decisions in the Pentagon are not really looking out for, national interest or policy or anything. What they're looking out for is their relationship with the arms industry. And they're supporting the arms industry. You might have noticed over decades that very often when people leave the Pentagon, they then become officials in the arms industry. You might also notice that an executive from the arms industry was appointed by Trump, Mr. Esper, as the defense secretary. So it's true, there's a lot of back and forth between the arms industry and the Pentagon, and that's been much criticized in the literature. Especially on the incredible amount of money that we spend on arms and so on. But the odd thing is, on the one hand, Trump attacks the Pentagon for being in bed with the arms industry. On the other hand, he's busy selling arms like mad. right? So he's selling them and or in some cases donate them to these Middle East countries that promise that they would, you know, support Israel, or at least acknowledge it and exchange ambassadors with Israel. Then he promised them lots of arms. He sells lots of arms all over the place. And so, how you notice, I mean, I don't have to point out the contradiction, right? The Pentagon is in bed with the arms industry. This is a bad thing. He can attack the Pentagon, not just soldiers, but the Pentagon. But the Pentagon, please send tons of arms overseas to all these iffy countries. Now, why do these pipsqueak countries in the Middle East want all these arms? Well, in part for ego reasons, right? But in part also the conflict in the Middle East, which by and large doesn't get much coverage in the US, is between, on the one hand, the Sunnis and the Shiites, but in terms of country relationships, it is the Saudis on the one hand, right, Sunni country, against fear of Iran. And then a third player comes in, which is Turkey, which is a Sunni country, right? But Turkey, Iran, Middle East countries, Saudi Arabia, they're all competing for what? Leverage, balance of power. And of course, the US contributed much to escalating all of this by nixing the treaty with Iran, which was, you know, historians, I'm sure, and not just quote unquote Democrats and liberals, will see that as a huge disaster. It was an imperfect treaty, but a step in the right direction. So there are these sort of three poles, four poles. There is Iran, there is Turkey, there is Israel, there is Saudi Arabia, each jockeying for leverage in the Middle East and arming themselves to the hilt. And who contributes a lot of the arms? The United States, to some extent in Turkey and Iran, also Russia, but we are the big arms merchants in that part of the world. And by arms merchants, I don't mean, you know, weapons that people carry. I mean serious missile capacity, serious planes now, serious intelligence gathering airplanes. And there's one step beyond that. Because of the nixing of the Iran treaty and Iran moving ahead on the nuclear front, if they really develop a nuclear weapon, right, then Saudi Arabia has promised also to develop a nuclear weapon, right? And in order to move in that direction, oddly enough, both the United States and Russia are helping Saudi Arabia with the technology which moves them, which is meant to be nowadays for civilian use, but which moves them closer to having the capacity to then becoming nuclearized. So what has for a long period of time been a real hotbed for trouble, right? Civil conflicts, the Syria mess, the Lebanon mess, Iran, Turkey, increasingly, you know, wanting some leverage in the region, or restoring the Ottoman Empire even. And now you have an escalation of military might amongst all these countries and the possible threat of actually some of them becoming nuclear, right? Israel, we know, is already nuclear, right? So what became, you know, sort of tensions and problems have been widely escalated, I would argue, by both Netanyahu and Trump for their own domestic political purposes. And while I am not whitewashing the trouble that the countries in the region can cause themselves and the fact that they have national interests, I am saying in a way that the escalation of creating a serious and potentially deadly crisis down the road has been really exacerbated, accelerated really, by Trump and Netanyahu for their own domestic political purposes. Now, there's one other wrinkle, and that you might have noticed, namely, there's a meeting in Doha, which is Oman, with the Taliban, and that is meant to be another feather in the cap of Trump, right? Because he is able to say, not only have all these countries now recognized Israel and I'm making peace in the Middle East, but also the Taliban situation is moving ahead. Well, there are multiple non-American reasons why that's moving ahead. Among other things, we're cutting by 50% the American soldiers there. And that leads both the government and the Taliban to have to recompute things and figure out some way to reach some agreements, whether they're in the long-term interest of any kind of civil and democracy in Afghanistan, or whether Afghanistan will just revert back to Taliban country. That's a whole other topic. But in any event, the fact that the American negotiator was able to push the parties is because it's high on the agenda of the Trump administration. Notice that Oman is another one of these pipsqueak countries in the Arab Peninsula. It is relevant for the U.S. In many ways as an ally because we have huge military air base there. And Oman is a tiny little country. It's got about 2.3 million people, of which 2 million of those people are expatriates. So there are very few locals running all of this and lots of expatriates. And many of these people that I talked about when I talked about how the downturn economically has sent all these temporary workers into unemployment either in the countries or sent them back home, and has curtailed remittances to like Philippines, which badly need them, in Bangladesh. So that's part of that syndrome, right? But Trump is able to go online and say, look, I am the big international actor. Unlike my predecessors, I've made peace here, there, and yonder, recognition of Israel, peace in other parts of the world. I'm acting everywhere, and I'm really successful. And all the things that have been frozen in place for years and decades, I have now, through my wonderful negotiating skills and that of Jared Kushner, have managed to produce major changes. Well, underneath this wonderful umbrella, one needs to look at all the specifics of what's happening, both short term and the potential of what could happen long term. Let me just quickly add one other thing, and that is, generally speaking, in an American election, nobody cares about foreign policy. Foreign policy is always ranked way below economic interests, in this case, maybe flu interests, virus interests. But foreign policy is not something that most Americans follow or very much care about, right? Except when the U.S. is, let's say, in Vietnam or something of that sort. So why make so much to do about foreign policy if most American foreign policy interests are close to zero, and in any event, they're not knowledgeable? I think it's not because Trump wants to prove anything in particular or wants to have us take note of the particulars of foreign policy. Even his supporters realize that that's not a main issue, but he wants to show what an incredible leader he is, not just domestically, but internationally. The most respected country in the world, the country that gets things done. So it fits with that image that he's trying to portray, not an image of a particular foreign policy, but rather his overall prowess internationally as well as domestically. There are, minor wrinkles here and there, but they don't really, feature in any major way. And he might get some little boost politically out of the foreign policy, particular in the United States, with conservative Jews in the United States, for whom Israel is a dominant issue. And those folks who might have swung over to Biden because of domestic and other issues, the recent polls indicate are swinging to Trump, because that is, unlike most Americans, that is a very primary concern for conservative Jewish people in the United States, which is a minority amongst American Jewish people, but nevertheless they exist. And those voters have now come and said, gee, he has done wonders in the Middle East and Israel, and he ought to be rewarded. But I would think that that matters maybe in New York City. It matters a little bit maybe a lot in Miami and Florida. But for the rest of the voters, it's just a show of power and prowess. Now, the other thing that has to do with military is the fact that Trump announced not only is he doing these great things overseas, but we have a brand new and secret major nuclear capacity. It's been under his auspices that this great new weapon system has been created. Most of the experts that I've been able to read, again, I'm no military expert, are saying, no, it's an exaggeration. What it is actually a miniaturization of nuclear weapon onto missiles that naval ships can carry, and that can be used for limited purposes. In other words, miniaturizing nuclear capacity rather than a broad gauge nuclear weapon. I don't know whether they're right or wrong, but supposing they're right, what it really means is that once that weapon system gets sprawled widely, Middle East, by the United States, to Russia, China, who knows, that makes the nuclear likelihood of having a nuclear conflict even greater, because people will say, well, it's not, how a country isn't dying or some major city from a first strike, but rather you scare people by, targeting a smaller city or targeting a ship or something, and that will lead to nuclear conflict. I'm not so confident about that. I think once nuclear weapons are used, it could easily escalate. And here I just want to remind you that in nuclear thinking, there is first strike capability. That is to say, are you able to hit your enemy in a serious way? And then there's serious second strike capability. Will that enemy have enough left over or hidden somewhere that they can strike back at you? In other words, you strike at somebody, but the damage will also be to you because they can strike back. And, major nuclear powers like Russia, like China, like the United States, maybe North Korea, one doesn't know for sure, have second strike capabilities. So if they're hit, they can hit back, right? Now, if you have a smaller nuclear weapon, it's of course not going to do huge damage. And then for sure, you can hit back. You could even use your first strike capability. Right? So then it's easy to imagine how you can have a massive nuclear conflict resulting even from minor nuclear weapons. But in any event, the discussion that he and what he says at rallies, that we now have a huge nuclear weapon, a new weapon system, that many experts say really isn't the case. Now, let me quickly turn to really very different subject, and that is what the virus is doing internationally. We hear about, the major outbreak countries and so forth, but the kind of economic damage that is being done in a country like India and on the African continent, experts in the field are reporting that all the progress that these countries have made economically have essentially eroded and will have eroded for many years. So right now, as we speak, people are saying that 250 million people will be returning to starvation. Lots of children, but also adults in India, in many countries in Africa, because a combination of global climate change and a reduction in the production of grains, for example, because of drought or flooding in some other countries. In addition to that, the economic incapacity of those countries to purchase food and to get it to people is leading to a level of malnutrition and starvation that hasn't been seen in over a decade. And people are saying, who are in those countries, that it's not only very serious, but it will haunt those countries for some years to come. So while even a year ago, one was talking about all the economic progress in India, maybe even down the road, catching up with China economically, and progress made in quite a few African states, and the development of a middle class in those African states, uh, much of that seems to be undermined and eroding because of the virus. So just as we are seeing, an increase in poverty and homelessness and a lack of education for poor people, which might haunt those kids for the rest of their education, that is today, they may never recoup, and the total inequality that is emerging even within the United States, the inequality that is emerging globally and internationally is absolutely stunning and will have long-term implications at a very time in which there's economic decline in productive Western countries and the United States, which also means that surplus money for aid and surplus food for helping others is in decline, even under the best of circumstances. And then you have people like Trump, who has cut foreign aid in any event to countries and is not being helpful at all, so that the World Food Program and other UN programs and the undermining of various international agencies has produced a perfect storm for people who live in the quote unquote third world in most countries. So we're not only talking about ourselves here and people dying and people getting sick, we're talking about worldwide disasters in the making, but already existing. And so the whole global picture, in a sense, needs to be seen in context. And we, of course, for perfectly correct reasons, are talking about ourselves and we're focused in ourselves when we really should recognize that we are to some extent in an interdependent world, no matter what Trump says. And in that world, it matters because viruses and diseases, as we now have learned, get globalized. If they get out of control, let us say a new virus in Africa, it will be another disaster. So all these things are interlinked. And I am not, in some senses, wanting to overreact on the globalization issue in the sense that, yes, things can be produced at home and we're not totally interlinked in every imaginable way, but we're sufficiently interlinked that what is happening in the rest of the world really does have to matter for us. And we really need to push our congressmen and senators and hopefully maybe a next president to be more mindful of not just being isolationist and inward looking, but recognizing that the degree of globalization, both in terms of the future development of these countries, as well as potential harm to ourselves in terms of disease and so on, really does matter to us. And one final small to some extent unrelated point. You might have read, we sometimes get news from the United Kingdom, England, where Mr. Johnson may not be as bad as Trump, but he is quite bad in his own right. And he is threatening to nix the treaty that Britain signed with the European Union. And he wants to change it unilaterally. And as has been pointed out in all the media, that is a violation of international law. You can't just unilaterally nix a treaty without violating international law. Where is that written? Well, it's written over almost centuries. Treaties are an old form of agreement, and countries have to, adhere to their commitments. Now, this may be negotiated and it may not actually happen, but it's part of a pattern which is very much part of the Trump pattern. It's also now part of Johnson's pattern in England of saying, the hell with international institutions, the hell with international law. We can unilaterally violate those things or leave those organizations. That too is very dangerous business because it is unraveling a very carefully put together post-World War system of international institutions and the development of much more international law, which made the world more peaceful in many ways. And in any event, it regulated things and reduced potentials for conflict and encouraged negotiations. So we should be encouraging ourselves and everybody else that if institutions and laws need to be reformed, that's one thing. But to nix them and to get out of institutions rather than reforming them is also playing with fire. So I hope I haven't depressed you too much. I'll try to think of something more cheerful. Meantime, here we live in lovely Santa Cruz. We have a roof, most of us have a roof over our head and enough food to eat. So I think we should be at least grateful for that. See you in a couple of weeks. Bye.